Oh, hey there. My name is Tim Murphy. Stop what you're doing right now and give me 10 seconds. I have something really important to share with you. Now, you're probably not happy with your job, and they probably aren't paying you the money that you deserve. Let me tell you about MercerCountyWorks.com. They're the #1 fastest growing job engine in New Jersey. And unlike Monster, Career Builder, and Glassdoor, Mercer County Works connects directly with employers to get your resume in front of decision makers. Okay, stop looking at me and go to MercerCountyWorks.com right now and upload your resume today.
And we are live. Welcome YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and my favorite, LinkedIn. Welcome to another episode of the Rise and Grind Show. Tonight we are talking about diversity and inclusion, why workplace equality has to be more than just 2 words. I'm your co-host, Duncan the Connect Harrison, and I'm here with my main man live from Qatar. Please tell them who you are.
Peace and blessings, everybody. Peace and blessings to the universe. This is your man, not your boy, Jay Tyler. I guess I'm the revolutionary resume writer or resume revolutionary. I can't get it right now, but the connect sound good for you, Dunk. It really does. I'm just glad to be here. Really want to get into the topic. So Duncan, take it away.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, as he said, he is the resume revolutionary. So if you need a resume, Jay Tyler is the man to see. So listen, we have some special guests with us tonight to talk about diversity and inclusion. I just want to give them the floor and give them a second to introduce themselves to our viewers tonight. And once again, if you are watching, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that share button, that bell for notifications. Also, if you have questions, if you want to join in on the conversation, definitely jump into the comments tonight. We're going to have a lively discussion about diversity, equity, inclusion, and as I say, injustice as well. So up first, we have Miss Melissa Purnell. Please introduce yourself to the viewers.
Thank you so much, Duncan. Thank you, Justin. I didn't know you had such cool names. Now I feel like I need a cool name. But my name is Melissa Purnell. I am based out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm a corporate training professional. Been doing learning and development, which includes a lot of work, especially in current times around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And very excited to be here today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for being here with us tonight. And so next we have Miss Whitney Harrington. Please introduce yourself to our viewers.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Whitney Harrington, and I am an HR professional that has been working across sectors for a very long time. I am also the founder and CEO of a new mobile app called Kith Republic that connects women with HR professionals to help them solve their work-related issues. So as you can imagine, in the work that I'm doing, both with my app and in my my other life, professional life as an HR consultant to organizations, particularly in the civil rights and social justice space, is that diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice is at the center of dealing with people at work. So I'm excited to bring that perspective and have this conversation with you all.
Yes, awesome. Thank you for being here with us tonight. And next we have Mike Huggins. Please introduce yourself to our viewers.
Hey, wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me. So I'm the founder and executive director of the Transformation Yoga Project. We're based in Philadelphia, or Greater Philadelphia, and we serve people who are impacted by trauma, and particularly those who have been incarcerated, dealing with substance abuse, or any other kind of trauma, if you will, and even youth. But prior to that, I was the CEO of a large medical device company. So I've seen this topic of diversity, equity, inclusion from both sides. So I'm really interested to have this conversation because I think it's something to talk about.
Definitely. That's right. So, I mean, listen, let's get straight into the questions. Jay Tyler, go ahead.
All right, first question, getting right into it, right? Oh, but before we begin, you have to do my trademark, Duncan, before I begin, all right? So without further ado, let's do what we came here to do. You dig? Let's get it on, all right?
Yes,
So
sir.
first question, everybody, first question. Describe what each of these words mean to you. Not dictionary, not Webster's, not Merriam-Webster's, none of that. What it means to you. First, diversity. Second, equity. Third, inclusion. What does it mean to you?
I'll jump in if you want me to start off. Sure. So I have to give a preface that my understanding of these terms has evolved over time, particularly as I transition from the corporate world to doing work in this area. So I'll give you my current understanding of that. Right. The idea of diversity is having different opinions, if you will, whether it's social, economic, or could be ethnic, could be race, but it also could be gender, and it could be sexual orientation. I mean, I think from a diversity point of view, I think it's more how do we categorize individuals, and are they part of the whole piece of the puzzle? Equity is, to me, it's quite simply, is it a level playing field? And we can circle back to that one, but the one that's most interesting to me is this idea of inclusion, because inclusion is taking that group of diversity that you may have in your organization or whatever, and how's that being utilized? Is everybody getting a say in what's happening? So we might have a diverse force, but is that force being included in the conversation or in the decision-making process or in the thought-making process? So yeah, that's my take on those three words.
I can follow up there, Mike. When I think about diversity, I think about both representation, but a representation of differences, different, experiences, different cultures, different backgrounds, different races, all of those things, right, are things that describe the differences that exist in our society. When I think about equity, I think about how do we, develop practices and supports and environments that meet everyone where they are. And so not creating the same, right? Not equal, but equitable. And so that some people might need a little bit step up, right, in order to reach that, kind of that level of equality because of some of the kind of the barriers that have existed in their lives, systemic, things that have existed in their lives. And then when I think about inclusion, I think about, an environment where everyone feels comfortable to be their true selves, to bring their true selves to work, right? And so they feel included in that and are safe in that. So that's how I would think about those things.
Yeah, Justin, I would completely agree with Mike and Whitney. And to put it simply, right, I think about diversity as the reality, right? So on this call here, we have men, we have women, we're different ages, different cultures, different backgrounds, we're in different locations, right? So diversity is the facts that, we're all different people, different thoughts, different mindsets. And then the equity is to Whitney's point of not giving everybody the same thing, but there's this really simple but powerful image that I've seen, I'm sure you guys are familiar with, where there's three people that are trying to look at a baseball game. One is extremely tall, one is short, and one person is in a wheelchair right now. To be equal would mean, hey, they all got to come to the game, but there's a gate, right, that's blocking them. So the taller person can see with no problem, but the shorter person needs, a stool or something in order to be able to see, where the person in the wheelchair needs a ramp, right? So that's the equity of, as Whitney said, meeting people where they are, making sure that people have what they need based upon what the circumstance is, and not just giving everybody the same thing and saying good luck. And then inclusion being, are we including people in the conversation, right? So when we're designing experiences, when we're thinking about what needs to be done and we're solutioning, are we including people, everyone in the conversation, and really listening, right? Not just saying, okay, well, we invited you to the party, but are we really giving people a voice to say, here is what is needed, and then actually taking action to that, to the point of making sure that people do belong or have that sense of belonging.
Nice.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate everyone's responses there. I think that's a really good tone setter. for this conversation today. I think everyone had some great examples, and it was different because it all meant from what you thought the explanation was of that definition. I do want to also introduce other panelists that just came on now, Dr. Kimberly Morse. So Dr. Kim, can you let us know who you are, what you're about, and then we'll have you answer the same question as well.
Sure. Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Duncan. I apologize. I did have some technical issues getting onto the broadcast, so I apologize for my tardiness. However, my name is Dr. Kimberly Morse. I have a PhD in IO psychology. I do focus on the DEI space, especially coming from the female space and a disability space. I've worked a lot with persons with disability. I've worked a lot with just a diverse population, so I've had a lot of exposure in that different arena. I have a lot of exposure with people speaking second languages, like their English isn't their first language, so it's coming in as that second language. So it's a very interesting type of perspective. However, I do want to kind of reaffirm what Melissa was speaking about. Diversity is a fact. We can't get around that. We've seen it more and more so. We see it even greater so in the younger generations. The millennial generation is more diverse than the Gen X, which is more diverse than the boomer generation. And then even our Gen Zers coming up are more diverse than our millennials. So what we're seeing is this increasing diverse population coming in. And we need to be really aware of that understanding that the experiences of all of these people is what makes us different. We can't all place everybody on the same level playing field. Equity doesn't mean that. You cannot have true equity if we place everybody on the same playing field, because white men have a different playing field than white women, who have a different playing field than Black men, who have a different playing field than Hispanic men, who have a different playing field, than women of different colors and backgrounds, racial and ability, and even sexuality. So when we're talking about diversity, we have to understand that everybody comes in with these different experiences and different backgrounds. Even where you grow up, somebody growing up in New Jersey is going to be different than somebody growing up in North Dakota, is going to be different than somebody in Arizona, and different from Washington, and different based on your background, on your skin color, on even the city, and whether you're straight, gay, LGBT, like a different member of an LGBTQ plus population. Even if you have a different ability level, if you're neurotypical versus non-neurotypical, if you have a physical disability or not. These are all things we need to be aware of that are coming into our workplace at greater and greater numbers. So equity means leveling it and making sure that all of these people with these diverse backgrounds have not even the same opportunities, but have what they need to be on the same level playing field. And inclusion for me is a choice. It's the choice we make to include all of these people and make them be able to speak to their own experiences and say in their workplaces, we're doing what we can and we're contributing the best we can in our own ways. And that's really what the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion really means, at least in my perspective. And of course, this could be different based on what everybody else says.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that, Kim. Appreciate it. You came in late, but you came in right on time. You know what I mean? All right. So now we got the tone set for the show. I really appreciated these answers. So now let's get into it a little bit as well. So why is this all important to a workplace? Why should we care?
So I'll jump in. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, and I hope I don't jump too much into another question you have, but everything that's been going on.
Do your thing.
Everything that's been going on the last couple of years, I think has highly encouraged organizations to recognize the obvious, right? That people coming into work are whole people. right? We're not just people that, punch numbers, do whatever, perform what we need to do and leave. It's been traditionally that you leave whatever's happening at home or in society at the door, you come into work and you get work done. But understanding that we are whole people, there's so much to it, right? So allowing people to bring themselves to work, allowing people to speak, to have a voice. One, it drives innovation, right? The more that we have thoughts and ideas and different perspectives, and understanding where people are coming from, it helps us, one, just from a bottom line perspective, to service customers, right? If you understand or appreciate the value that people bring to the table just as human beings, right? So I think there's the one piece of sometimes you just have to be able to explain to senior leadership that diversity contributes to the bottom line, and embracing diversity contributes to the bottom line. And then the other piece of that is that people, like right now, there's such a race for talent right now, especially with the pandemic and things that happen. People are competing for talent in different ways. And when people go to a workplace where they feel like I am respected, I am heard, I am appreciated, I am seen as a person that's contributing versus somebody that can just be stepped over, to go to the next person, they're more likely to contribute more, to show up more, and to stay, right? And to perform better. Like there's so much research and study that goes into when people feel that they are appreciated and their diversity and their differences are appreciated, they're willing to work harder, and to do more. And for an organization, I don't know what else, you know what I mean? Like what more of a competitive advantage you can have than people that are that come willing to show up and are fully engaged at work. So I think there's just a lot of facets there to really embracing diversity in the workplace.
So let me just jump in really quickly and we can spin back around to this question. So would corporate America, the public sector, private sector, government, care about diversity, equity, and inclusion if it did not impact their bottom line?
I would say no. I don't know, Melissa, what you say?
I need to process that one because I think, right, sometimes what happens is things show up as buzzwords, right? It's a buzzword, you do it. And then companies start to see things and they're like, wait a second, there's something there. So I don't know, like I'm trying to think, maybe not, because I want to say years ago, before we were even in the workplace, I think people were seen as cogs, right? You come, you get things done, and you go home. Nobody cared about making sure there was balance. Nobody cared about making sure there was a voice that was heard. It was just you get the work done. And I think until it got to a point where it was like, women coming into the workforce is kind of a good thing. It's helping us out. It almost seems like it's not until things start to contribute to the bottom line that organizations care. But that's a hard question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, in my answer to the initial question, I was going to say that in addition to the things around like the more positive spin and positive lens on why organizations and companies, are moving towards diversity and equity and inclusion, there's also been catalysts that have been more negative, right, that we are seeing. And so one of the things that we have seen is one, that we have an increasing amount of EEOC complaints, right, and things like that. And so, it is a thing where it's like, if I don't want to keep having that, I have to figure this out, right? Additionally, right, going to the thing around diversity, we're seeing diversity and changes and differences in generations. And so the generations that are coming in are no longer just sitting there with their head down, getting the work done, being willing to do, whatever I'm told to do and sit myself in the seat. These people are saying, no, they're demanding change. They're demanding for you to treat us better, and not necessarily thinking they have to go out somewhere else to find it, right? And we'll sit there and make you. And so I think it's what is happening is that, you can talk about the bottom line. I agree that those are buzzwords. I think it's making people uncomfortable. And when you're uncomfortable, and it continues to be uncomfortable, right? It is forcing people to change so that they can try to find another way to be comfortable. I think that's what this is all about, and why organizations are shifting. Yeah.
So maybe I could jump in just because I was on that side, right? So I was the CEO of a pretty large company and the COO of a multi-billion-dollar company. So I've been, Whitney, right where you're at. I mean, I appreciate your comment because, and I've had a chance to do some soul searching there, because I'd say back, and I'm going back, I'm dating myself a little bit, going back about 8 years or so, but I thought that I was sort of a progressive CEO when it came to these issues, and really thought about diversity, if you will, and based on what I knew at the time, at least what I, my subconscious understanding of that. And what's clear is that that understanding was not right. It was a fallacy in the thought process, but not just with me, but the whole system, or the whole power system. And I think we started with your first question was about the definition of diversity versus inclusion. And I think this idea of diversity, the executives kind of get it, but it's the idea of the inclusion and the idea of having everybody have a say in that is what's been missing. And so I think, at least from my perspective, I see a shift because of all the things that are going on, the cultural changes happening, the protests going on. I think it is uncomfortable for a lot of people, but I think it's uncomfortable in a good way, because it's forcing us. When I say us, I mean, I guess I could be the poster, privileged white guy executive, former executive, and it's forcing us to come to terms with these topics that we've kind of glossed over, maybe consciously or subconsciously. So I think it's forcing us to directly address these topics, and I hope we can go deeper than just finding diversity. To me, it's the inclusion, and that's where the power is that we need to be dealing with. And one last point of that, I also, back in the day, we used to focus on, we talk about, is it profitable? We used to talk about being an effective leader, and an effective leader was one who delivered profits. And I know that's still true today, but I see it. I do see an evolution that we're looking more. In addition to being effective, you need to be a responsible leader, and responsibility is. I think we're starting to see that with global warming, with all the protests going on, that we need to be responsible not only to our bottom line, but we need to be responsible to our community, to our other stakeholders who are not shareholders of the company. So I think it's maybe not moving as quickly as we need it to be, but I do see a shift. At least we're having these conversations, and I do think there's people scrambling at the corporate level trying to figure out how to do this. And I think there is an opportunity, if we can do it right, to make meaningful change, not just kind of paper over it and say we did something.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I'd love to jump in at that point. I think one of the biggest things that seems to be missing is, statistically speaking, when we look at the composition of people, like persons in executive level positions in organizations like Fortune 500 companies, we're seeing statistically it is still exceptionally significantly predominantly white males. We are seeing a statistically fewer percentage of white females, even less Black females taking the helm at these organizations. You almost never see it. In fact, you're more likely to see a Black male head up a company than you are a Black female. So when I speak about these things, which are more likely to see in the hierarchy, white male, Black male, white female, Black female. And yes, we need to be paying attention to this. And some key numbers that we need to be aware of is, of 100% of Black females, they actually have a higher percentage of participation rate in the workforce. At 77% of Black females are participating actively in the workforce than almost any other percentage of persons. That's a huge percentage of their specific population than any other demographic. So how come we're not seeing that reflected in our executive level positions? So what happens that we see trickle down is, in the executive level positions, we're seeing predominantly still those white males. And it's no offense to you, Mike. I know that's not necessarily you, but that tends to, I'm sorry, he's just a white male, I'm sorry. But that tends to be what it is. And then it kind of trickles down. So it leaves us at this disadvantage where we're seeing persons of these different races and different genders coming down. Like, we don't hear about persons who identify as an Asian background or Hispanic or LGBTQ plus identifying as executive leadership in these organizations. So what ends up happening in these organizations is they have these executive boards that are still predominantly white male, making these major decisions about the companies and the decisions that are going to really impact the lower level employees. But who makes up those lower level employees? That's where their diversity comes into play. So we have this differentiation of dynamics between who makes up those front lines, those customer facing employees. Those predominantly tend to be female and tend to be, unfortunately, predominantly Black females or even Hispanic females. White females are marginally more likely to be in the manager position, and then they get this benefit where, and this is an unfortunate differentiation where Black females versus white females. If a white female comes off as opinionated about something, like if I voiced an opinion very strongly, it would just be like, oh, well, she's passionate about it. Whereas, let's say Whitney or Melissa or any other Black female comes off with the same type of energy about the same type of conversation, it would be like, oh, well, they're an angry Black female. Well, that's unfair. That's significantly unfair to them. And it's unfair to me because if I was Mike, for example, and again, no offense to anybody on the call, but if I was a white male, I wouldn't be looked at as being overly opinionated. It would be, well, you would be considered assertive. So I think the words that are used to define who we are very A, gendered, and B, not, I well, they're racist, to be quite frank. But then even still, yes.
No, I wanted to name what you're referring to because I think it's really right. But I think it's important to call these things out, that the difference that while gender does have a very, provides a disproportionate kind of like disparate impact in the organization, that the benefit that women and particularly white women get to benefit is from that, is the privilege, right? That they have the privilege.
Absolutely, yes.
And so that's what you're describing when it comes to like, that when I speak, I'm being more passionate. It's because you're privileged as a white person, and that your whiteness, right, is a benefit, right, that allows white women to prosper and have certain, privileges in our world that other genders, other women don't have, and particularly, and also, men of color as well.
Yeah,
absolutely. No, and thank you, because I was hoping not to alienate people, because unfortunately a lot of white people hate that word privilege, and I'm sure you've anybody who's not white has probably experienced that. If you call out a white person and you say, oh, that's just your privilege, a lot of white people have this immediate negative response to the word where they say, well, I'm not privileged. What are you talking about? And they get very defensive over it. But you're 100% correct. It's exactly that. It's a privilege that I have based on nothing other than the color of my skin, which I didn't even technically earn by nothing other than being born with a different melanin than somebody else. And I'm fully aware of that. And that gives me a different voice. So if I, like Whitney, if you and I are in the same room and you and I have a conversation about something that's going on and you say, hey, this is going on, well, you might not be able to come into the room and say that, but I can, because they'll listen to me because of that privilege, because of my white skin. Unfortunately, one thing that does happen, even because I am a woman, if I speak to these things about being discriminated against or biased against because I am a female, they tend to not hear me, even as a white female. However, if Mike voiced it because he's a white male, they would be like, oh, he's a white male and he has certain experiences. He must be knowledgeable. So the unfortunate fact of the matter is that when we're looking at the bottom line, companies tend to look at white males as that golden standard, which is unfair to everybody else. And when you go down the levels, which is extremely unfortunate, that we look at that privilege, and unfortunately it does tend to be anybody male comes before anybody female in most cases, not all. And I'm going to definitely significantly state that there are definitely cases where my privilege comes into play, and I would be regarded higher than like Duncan or Justin, even though Justin and I have been at the same level. And I know Justin personally, so this I can speak to. Justin and I have been at the same level professionally previously. So I can speak to the fact that he and I have at one point had the same exact education or comparative experiences and education to be like, we're both on the same level. Where do we match up? At one point, I'm here. At another point, he's here. But at what point do we level out, and why does it matter? The basic fact is it shouldn't matter. We all matter when we're coming in with positive work environment and positive focuses. However, when we look at that higher level, it's still predominantly men who look and sound a lot like Mike. And it's not Mike's fault by any means. But then the second level comes any other male. Women tend to fall below men, and Black women even lower on that scale. And it's really unfortunate because there's completely significantly more Black women who are smarter who are definitely smarter than me and more talented than me that should have a higher seat at the table. And why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't people who are more talented and smarter than the people who are at that table be there? But until people of these different voices and different experiences really be there, and that's really where the point falls, unfortunately.
So let me just, I don't know if anybody else had anything, but let me just ask this other question to kind of couple with that, because one of our viewers did have a question, and they asked, what are some practices to effectively increase awareness about the workplace, process, organization, technology, and behaviors, right? So really, I think they're really asking, what are some of the best practices for DE&I? But I guess even before we get into that conversation, I need to ask the panelists. So before an organization approaches, DE&I, because it's a buzzword, right? I've never seen so many of my friends become, DE&I directors, overnight in my life, right? But I guess before an organization should even go that route, should they have the conversation about anti-racism before they begin to talk about DE&I, or there's two separate conversations that need to be had?
Yeah, so if I were to jump in, so what's interesting is I think what Kim, Mike, and Whitney were speaking of all tie into this, right? Because the question about how do you handle this at work? What are the processes? What do you have to put in place, right? There's one thing to, just like you said, Duncan, say the words. Put it out there, talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. There's also the awareness piece, right? So Whitney had to just call it out, right? Like, let's really call out what we're talking about here and what the reality is. So part of it is the awareness. Before we can start to educate, before we can start to put things in place, we have to bring the shields down and start to bring the guards down. Let's talk about what the reality is. Let's talk about what's happening, and let's call a thing in a way that hopefully doesn't get people's defenses up, but it's really just, we need to create the awareness first, right? And then we can start to educate. But another piece of it that I think all the panelists really touched on is the work, right? The tough part is the work that has to happen. It's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to have training classes on it. It's another thing to have discussions and panels. But when you start to look at your organization and say, why is our board of directors all white men? How many people of color do we have in senior leadership? Why is it that, our frontline employees are people of color, but when we get to the senior level, it's not that, right? So that's when the work comes in. So I think there are definitely levels. It's not a flip of a switch. And just like you said, Duncan, I see it all the time, like all of a sudden there's all these Black women that are being promoted, which is a beautiful thing. It's a good thing, right? But are we doing it for the right reasons? Do those women have seats at the table, or are they the face in order to say, hey, look, we're doing the right thing? So I think there's the awareness. Let's make sure that we are clear on what we're talking about and what's happening. But then there's the work, because that's when people get uncomfortable, when it's like, oh, wait, you want to increase people of color in leadership? When you start talking about equity of right. If we are, and Mike talked about the playing field. If the playing field is hills, I'm in a wheelchair, I'm shorter, I'm taller, I am differently abled, and I get different tools in order to navigate that. How do we make sure that people understand that that's that's okay, right? That people shouldn't feel threatened because other people have now the same access to something that you've always had. So I think the difference is it's the work. Like it's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing we start to put metrics in place, and you start to measure things to say, are we really reflecting what it is that we are talking about? So it's a process that does not happen overnight or just by promoting people of color, which is a good, it's not to say that it's not a bad step, but I think sometimes there's these companies, and I've gotten the question of like, what do? We want a DE&I strategy. What should we do? And it's like, it's not just this thing that you turn on. It's really looking at the infrastructure of your organization and what are you really trying to do here? And do you realize that that really changes the trajectory of the entire company, not just a thing that you do to say, okay, we did it.
I agree with you, Melissa. I really appreciate all of that. And that was kind of exactly what I was thinking. I am actually in the process of getting a certificate in DEI. And one of the things that we have been learning is this idea that you have to start with emotional intelligence, right? And that's exactly what you're talking about in awareness. And just, I have my notes here. It says emotional intelligence is the capacity to be aware of, control, and express one's emotion and to handle interpersonal relationships judiciously and empathetically. And where that comes in is exactly what Melissa was talking about, right? Like we have to be able to interact with one another, give each other feedback, support one another in a way that doesn't necessarily always make us feel threatened personally. Mm-hmm. And that's where a lot of the challenges in kind of moving this work forward. Dr. Kim, as you were mentioning, people, when I hear privilege, I start thinking, oh my goodness, they're calling me racist. And, it's like, we have to be able to be self-aware enough and have enough emotional intelligence to be thinking about, okay, not only how is this making me feel and being aware of like my emotional reactions to that, but also kind of, well, what does this mean for other people who are different from me, right? And how can I show up in ways that are both, productive for myself, but for the whole and for others. And so I think that's really important when anyone is starting any type of this type of change process, which that's exactly a change management process that this requires. And then I also agree with the idea of what I call operationalizing, right? And there's, I have been frustrated with the pace of the DEI work because it feels very informative, very, it's training based. Let me help get people on a common language, right? And then it stops there. And so what I don't see is like, okay, well, what does that mean in actual terms of like getting things done, right? And so we can talk all day and set goals and set our diversity statement about what we want to do, but it always comes down to there still isn't any change made. And so it requires you to do things, right? It requires you to make hard decisions. It requires you to contend with things like if I have all white leadership, white male leadership, and there's only so many positions, what does that mean, right? Like if you call yourself wanting to be, a diverse and equitable and inclusive organization, maybe someone has to go, right? And so there are things that people are just unwilling to do, unwilling to operationalize, that are the barriers. And so those are the things that people can be thinking about is like, what does it actually do to take that and making some really difficult decisions?
So, if I would just add on to that, louder than words. And I think there's been a lot of words put out by management teams about here's what we're trying to do. We want to embrace this, but are they really embracing it? And to me, the senior leadership of organizations have to take the lead to do the inner work so that they can. And I love the term you said, have to be uncomfortable. And that's why I think going on around us is really important because it sends messages that the status quo is not acceptable. And we need to hear that. I guess I'm speaking for all privileged white male executives, but we need to hear that message for change because otherwise, we're doing the inner work and we have these subconscious biases that influence our decision-making process. So I think, and then what if we don't embrace that at a senior level, then it becomes a paper exercise. It becomes, there'll be training, there'll be this and that, but it's not really embraced. It's not part of the value system of an organization. It may be part of their logo or their slogans, but it's not a part of the value system until the value systems of organizations change to be more inclusive. And that's, so the actions, in my mind, actions have to happen two ways. They have to happen on a macro level, meaning that senior executive organizations have to become better, as you said, have emotional intelligence, so that they can understand that they are the problem, part of the problem, or the big part of the problem, and take action to it. But then that also has to be followed up by a system in the process, so that there can be some metrics that make sense, that are real, and that are impactful, and are measurable, so that it can be a bottom up and a top down, where we can then see some true change happening there.
So Mike, I want to jump in for a second. Yeah, if I want to jump in for a second, Mike, you leading into my question that I want to ask. And so, how do you measure the effectiveness of these programs?
Well, and Justin, I'd love to jump in on that. I'm sorry, for the effectiveness. So there's a couple things kind of going on there. And I definitely love to kind of expand on it. So one thing that I think a lot of companies are falling victim to is this idea of bringing people up and promoting people, but for the wrong reasons. Almost like we've heard a common complaint about a lot of people saying, oh, they only got it for affirmative action. But this, and we've almost seen this like, oh, it's like a tokenism. So they bring somebody in of a different gender or a different skin color that still has this same underlying ideals, or they're just like that faceplate to be like, oh, this person looks different, so they can still agree with us type of mindset. Well, that's not really diverse. That's not like an inclusive mindset. That's not an inclusive organization. If you're hiring or you're promoting somebody just to be like, oh, look, here's our token woman, or a token Asian person, or a token Hispanic, or a token Black woman or Black man, or whatever, that doesn't actually really promote an inclusive environment. It just really promotes the same mindedness, but saying, hey, look, here's our token person of this diverse background who still matches everything we've said over here. So we don't actually have to change anything because they're going to agree with us. Part of the problem with that is, why are they agreeing with you? Are they agreeing with you so that they don't lose their job, so that they don't lose their financial security? Statistically speaking, women, Black women, especially even Hispanic women, are less likely to have a financial security than men, especially white men. You see more women and Black women living in poverty level statuses than white men. So these are things that people have to think about. Are these people really agreeing with you because they agree, or are they agreeing with you so they don't lose their job? So that's one problem. The second part of this comes into when we're looking at measuring these components. We really need to look at something that companies already measure. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about these things that are these counterproductive work behaviors that lead to things like increased turnover, absenteeism. We're looking at some of these other components that affects that overall bottom line. Technically speaking, when we look at it, it costs an organization almost 2 times the annual salary to replace an executive level employee. Think about that. So if they have to replace an executive level employee who's making, let's say hypothetically, $500,000 a year, they're going to spend $1 million just to replace them. That doesn't even include the annual salary of the new employee going forward. So what they try to do is make sure that their high paid employees are happy so they stay. But when we look at the lower level employees, we're looking at things like that, those counterproductive work behaviors. Are they meeting any specific metrics, whatever this may be, especially if it's a sales role or a call center role? Are they meeting the amount of calls they need to make? Are they coming in late? Are they leaving early? Do they need to take a specific amount of days off? Are they calling out sick a lot? People who are unhappy with their jobs are more likely to take off more sick days throughout the year than people who are happy with their jobs. They're more likely to be late than people who are happy with their jobs. So when we're talking about some of these components, while we may be saying, inclusion matters, but when we look at how to measure that, we measure that in those pro-organizational behaviors. If a person's happy with their job, They're going to come in on time. They're going to give their 100% as best as they can. They're going to do everything and work hard for their positions. It comes down to really this, and I break it down to Maslow's kind of hierarchy of needs, where we look at that level of love and belongingness. If they feel like they belong, they're going to act like they should be there. If they feel like they should, and they feel, hey, I'm committed to this, guess what? That behavior is going to resonate exponentially throughout the organization, which comes into retention and productive organizational behaviors, which is exactly what organizations look at when we're talking about the versus the negative counterproductive work behaviors or the pro-organizational behaviors. And that's what organizations can really use to measure if their tools are effective. Who's staying and who's not staying? Why are they leaving? If they do an actual exit interview with people, they're going to see, well, what type of demographic is more likely to leave versus more likely to stay? What are they saying they're leaving for? And even that might not necessarily be accurate. If someone says, hey, I'm leaving because so-and-so is paying more. Well, maybe that's true, but maybe they're leaving because they've been mistreated. Maybe they're leaving because their manager has been disrespectful or maybe even created a hostile work environment. Nobody wants to deal with a manager who's belittling them on a regular basis, who is literally telling them things that nobody should hear in a workplace. And I've heard...
Just really quickly, I just want to make sure, I think these are really great points. I just wanted to circle back to Jay Tyler just to make sure I understood the question. I do think that you were finishing the question, and I just want to make sure we heard that too, so that we're all answering the full question there.
No problem, Whitney. So basically, we're just all talking about, from a perspective like, how do we know that, these diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are working, right? So how do we measure its effectiveness? What does that look like? And then also, what are the indicators that these programs are either working or not working? So that's what the full question was in terms of that. So.
Thank you.
My apologies. Thank you, Whitney. Mm-hmm. Sorry. Feel free to cut me off. I'm so sorry.
The only thing I would add to what we said is this, that we have to be careful about the measurement. I think it's a great question because look, I've seen it happen, and I didn't do it myself, but I've seen it happen where the EEOC comes in and says, you don't have enough women, and we didn't have enough women in senior management, and so senior management went in and fixed the problem. They went out and hired a senior level person, but they didn't change the culture of the organization so that problem's going to happen again. And maybe that's some of what Dr. Kim was talking about, the culture was there. So that's my point, is that I think we need a macro and a micro approach. I think it's not enough just to look at the numbers. They're important. I'm not discarding that. But if the numbers are just going to there to solve a problem, you're not really solving the problem. We got to get to the heart of the causes of why this is happening. And I think that's why I keep going back to the fact that we've got to continue to educate. And I'll give you one quick example, and I'll move on. But there's been recently all these voting issues going on in Georgia, and I happen to be in Georgia at the very moment. And several Black executives wrote a letter saying they oppose this change in the voting law. And now all of a sudden, a lot of other executives are falling in line saying we oppose this. And one could argue, saying, well, why did they have to take the lead on this issue? Mm-hmm. Of course, it's voting rights. But we could talk the same about diversity, equity in the workplace. Why are we not taking a lead role in addressing this at a value of the core values of the organization? Because I think, Melissa, you said at the beginning, if we have a diverse workforce, we're inclusion. It's better. We have better ideas. Ultimately, you're going to be more profitable. Once you can fully digest that. But when we don't do that, it becomes like another task, becomes another this, and something I'm being forced to do. And so we don't embrace it. We have to find a way that we can understand how to get real change. And I keep going back to that education is that I see it coming. I think it needs to be happening more. I think it needs to be more radical, and so that we can get to real systemic change in this here? That's at least my perspective.
I think that I would add a couple things. So far too often, the decisions about what measures or constitutes kind of a level of diversity, equity, inclusion is made by one group of people, right? And and I challenge that, right? Because it's like, well, how do we know that either the measures that you set up, the way that you're assessing them, the way that you are communicating your progress, right, has anything to do with what the people who are the diverse people expect or want or need, right? Without bringing them into that process, right? And so I often like to, while all the different metrics around exit interviews and things like that are really, interesting places to bring, I would argue that in some cases those things do dilute, right, the actual real causes. I heard you mention that, Dr. Kim, but I think starting with kind of what is our baseline based on the people who are experiencing this, right? And so doing surveys where we're understanding what is the experience, what would they like to see different, and then using that as the baseline with which to measure your progress and what you should be doing to support those employees, right? And so really having it be an inclusive process that is driven by the people most affected by this work.
Yeah.
So and Melissa, you go ahead, and I'll jump in right after you if I can.
Yeah, no problem. I was going to say, right, so one, all the panels, you guys did so many things that there were so many thoughts going through my head. But when I think about measurement, right, I think sometimes what the challenge is the goal isn't defined before the actions are put in place, right? It's like this reactionary thing of, oh my goodness, we got to train people in DE&I, we've got to do this and we have to do that. And then a couple years later, to your point, Justin, it's like, well, did it work? But did we ever sit down in the beginning and say, what are we trying to accomplish, right? Like, what is it that we want our organization to look like in 5 years? What do we want to be different? Because in order to determine whether or not it worked, because I agree with Whitney, sometimes the measurement is not just to Mike's point, making sure there are 7 women in senior leadership, making sure we have 2 people of color on the board of directors, but maybe it's a cultural thing, right? So are we looking at our employee engagement surveys? Are we tapping into the pulse of what the culture of the actual organization is versus making sure that we're checking the boxes for the numbers? So I think sometimes we have to take a step back and make sure we're looking at what are we trying to accomplish here to inform what it is that we do, so that way we can go back and look. And I also want to take a quick step back to make sure that we don't forget that DE&I is not just about race. It's about age, it's about gender, it's about gender identity, it's about perspective, thought, religion, where you grew up, background, military, not military, all those different things. And I think especially in the workplace, remembering that, I know for me, some of the most successful initiatives I've been on were with people that might have looked like me, but thought totally different than me, right? That's diversity as well. And sometimes I think we look at diversity as what we see, and we're not recognizing that diversity is a lot of what we don't see, and just making sure that we are listening to people. And I think about it just as a mom, right? Sometimes I don't listen to my teenagers. I think you don't know what you're talking about, but they have a lot of great input. And sometimes when I listen to them, I'm like, you know what? You're pretty smart. So I just want to make sure that we're also recognizing. I know that was something for me to realize when I first started to put my, foot into DE&I work, that it's not just about the buzzwords of religion, race, and whatever. It's how we think, it's how we process, it's how we were raised, it's our parental influences, all those things that we bring to the table all, contribute to the DE&I conversation.
So I just want to throw this scenario out there and I think Melissa, you actually made a great point. But let's just say, we had a company that was made up of all male Asians, right? Small company, very successful. Let's just say they sell microchips, right? A small tech company, and so I guess really for the sake of DE&I. Do they need to say, well, because of this big DE&I boom, we need to become more diverse? Or could they just say, well, listen, we have a great team here that works. We don't need to change anything.
Good question.
Well, ultimately, I think it really depends on what their strategic plan is. And it really depends on where their goals are going. Ironically, before I worked with Justin, I did work for a Korean company where more than 50% of my colleagues were from South Korea. So it becomes very interesting to see the cultural differences in what their goals are, what their plans are. If they're speaking specifically from a diversity standpoint and they're saying we need to be more diverse, well, if they only have one viewpoint, then yes, they're going to need to be more diverse. If they're even asking the question, then the inherent answer is yes. But ultimately, it comes down to, what are your goals? What are you looking to accomplish? Why does it matter? An interesting case study would be looking at Nintendo. Nintendo, way back when, in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, actually started out as a card company. They made trading cards. And that's something most people probably don't know. And they realized in the 1900s, obviously that wasn't going to keep working. As card games kind of trickled out, what do they need to do? So they had to introduce some level of diversity. In fact, the character Mario was based on somebody who works for them. So these are things they need to be mindful of. If they need to keep moving forward and keep moving ahead and be relevant and keep being kind of, to, I believe it was Melissa's point earlier, continuing this level of innovation, they're going to have to bring in differences of opinions and beliefs and ideas. You cannot have the room full of the same ideas and expect to have innovation happening. You're going to have to bring in people with different backgrounds, different experiences, different understandings of the world. Otherwise, you're never going to move forward. So they're going to be stuck in the same one point. And if we wanted to look at somebody very much like the Kodak pictures, they almost became completely irrelevant because they refused to move forward. Look at Blockbuster. They're completely out of business because they didn't bring in different experiences and different ideas and move on. Even Toys R Us is trying to rebuild because they refuse to bring in that different idea, different backgrounds, different anything, basically. So the necessity of inclusion and including these different people and different understandings of the world is essential to this ongoing successfulness of any organization, especially if they want to engage in any type of globalization.
So really great points, Kim. And to Duncan, maybe I'll give you a real life example that I saw. That the company I used to work with was a medical device company, and we're selling orthopedic devices for trauma. So these were used in surgery in the middle of the night. And so if it's a car accident or a gunshot wound, they would be called 24/7. So the company, the sales force was in the OR room all the time. We had probably 99% of our sales force were men. And we were called out about that. And we, meaning we, not me personally, but we were called out. We said, because only men can do that job, because it's a brutal job. It's 24/7. They got to lug this surgical equipment into the OR. They've got to go into some areas at night. Some of these, surgeons are kind of rough around the edges as far as their language they use in surgery. And so we used all these we had a rationale for not bringing women in. And we were called out on that, quite honestly. And we did bring women in, and they were quite successful. I think for some of the reasons that Dr. Kim mentioned, but we had to make some accommodations, maybe change our culture, some of the training, how we went about, how we hauled ourselves out in the OR room. But it can happen, and I think it goes to the point that these programs, if they're done properly, can show results, but they have to be really well thought through. And there has to be, I keep going back to this point, there needs to be like a kick in the pants for people sometimes to take action, because we love the status quo. If things are not broken here, if it's not perceived to be broken here, we're going to put our efforts somewhere else. We need to have the attention of senior management, and Whitney, I totally get your point that why do they get to make call those shots? I totally get that. But we need to make it so uncomfortable that they have to deal with this issue, and we have to deal with it in a very broad way, so we can bring other people who are not direct, shareholders of the company to have a say in how we deal with these issues.
Yeah, I think, Mike, what you basically said is it's easy, right? It's easy to not make change. It's easy to leave things as is. Just like you said, they, bring it. The first thing I thought was, well, maybe maybe there needs to be changes made if things are dangerous and the language is out of control, or whatever the case is. So it's easy to keep the status quo, but it's easy going to get you ahead. And I think that's just in life, right? It's we can make easy choices in order to keep things very comfortable. But then you have just what Dr. Kim said, then you have the blockbusters and you have the folks that, go out of business because I don't want to make change. It's easy just to keep it this way. We've been easy breezy and we'll keep it going, but that's not what's going to get you ahead.
Interesting point of view. Really, I want to go in a different zone though, because I know we've been focusing on, this broader conversation, but I'm going to bring it to the present day. All right, if we can. So it is COVID-19, and I just read an article about COVID-19's indirect impact on women in the workplace. And so I want to kind of talk about this a little bit and focus on maybe the micro side of this, maybe on one aspect of diversity. Now, it was saying in this article that the women are now being forced to go home more, right, to take care of the family because of the COVID-19 implications, right, because the kids are at home. They're being homeschooled, distance learning, things like that, and they're leaving the workplace at this time. What do you think COVID-19 impact is on women's progress in the workplace and in terms of helping with diversity? Is it hurting or helping, or do you agree with this same article statement?
Yeah, I would just jump in here to say that I 100% think that it's going to hurt women in the workplace and have a long-lasting effect on that, right? I think for a couple of reasons. So one, kind of related to that article, right? I believe that there was a time when the unemployment numbers at some point during the quarantine, the COVID-19 quarantine, indicated that there was a number of people who had been who became unemployed, and at one point they were all women. Right, they were literally all women who had become unemployed. And so, there's a number of reasons for it. I think one, that women tend to make up the majority of the essential workforces of those that are on the front lines as it relates to COVID-19. So your nurses, people who are working with children, teachers, et cetera, right? And then, as you mentioned, right, that women have a disproportionate, responsibility in the household as is typically the primary caregiver in their homes. And so whether that's for children, whether that's for aging parents or other dependents, right, that there is this need that women, tend to feel, right, out of either an obligation or things that they feel committed to do. And so when you layer all of that together, that's a lot, right? And I think when I, specifically on our app, we've gotten a number of women who have reached out to say, like, I can't handle all of this, right? Like, there's no way that I can do my job. And so, if I am still working, right, I have to leave on my own, make my own choice to leave because I can't deal with, remote learning with my children. I can't, be in the same one-bedroom apartment with my partner who's also on the phone having Zoom calls and things like that, or that they've been let go and they still have to be able to manage all these things without without income and stuff like that. So I definitely think it's true. And I think that, we were already, behind in the workforce, right? And so, like, when you put that together, right, that there has been documented history of women being behind in the workforce, particularly women of color, and then you add this particular barrier on top of it of not being able to maintain their workforce position because of the COVID-19, it is absolutely going to have a lasting effect, right, that will take years and years and years to overcome.
So I'd really love to be able to speak to kind of Whitney's point. And Justin, I messaged you, but I'm like, why'd you have to go here?
Yeah, I saw that right now. Yeah.
So I know the other panelists don't know, I do have 3 kids, and this is somewhat important. My oldest is 19. He graduated in 2020. So he graduated high school in 2020. Senior year was quarantined, ruined, quote unquote, the whole thing, right? My middle child finished up middle school, 8th grade graduation, same thing, quarantined, couldn't do it. My youngest is in 1st grade. So that meant all of last year into this year, she's been in kindergarten and 1st grade. So she's been virtual the whole time. She only just went back to school not even a month ago.
Mm-hmm.
Out of the entire year, I can count on one hand the amount of times that her father, who lives with me, has actually done any type of assistance to help her with her schooling, because it's less than 5. And he'll admit it, it's been maybe 2 or 3 times. That means in the entire year, when I was finishing up my doctorate, I wrote a book, I contributed to another book, I conducted research, I worked, I did all of these other things. I also, at the same time, had to literally virtually teach my kindergartner transitioning into 1st grade, my 8th grader transitioning into an excelled academic program in high school, plus my high school senior who had a 504 plan, so he's a special needs student, finishing up his senior year in high school. I can't tell you how many times I've had to manage so many things at once on my plate that when I've gone into meetings with executive teams talking about, hey, these are some things that we'd recommend. Here are some assessments we'd give. Here's what we really want the direction for you to be in, that I have to sit here and simultaneously say, I'm sorry, can you excuse me a moment? I have to go manage something else. And when I'm done with these meetings, what I look like, or at least what I feel like I look like, is completely unprofessional. Whereas the flip side for the men, that never happens. If my significant other says, hey, I have this work meeting, he goes upstairs, he gets to close himself in his bedroom/office and says, okay, I'm here. And he gives his full 100% attention. I cannot do that. And I know I'm not the only woman in that position. So women, to Whitney's point, are disproportionately handling all of the childcare while they're still expected to work and provide that 100% of what they're giving to their employer. I'm going to tell you right now that it's physically impossible. My days, by noon, I'm completely stressed and I'm completely out of my mind with this. I can't even do this, and I'm ready to throw my hands up and say, I completely give up. And literally being in that position, by the time 3 o'clock comes, when my daughter's done with school, I'm like, I don't even care what you're doing. Just, I need to get some work done where I'm focused and can actually do this. And this is a problem, and it does disproportionately affect women. Women are more likely, and I can speak from experience, to just say, you know what, I cannot do this work. Like, I cannot work because my kids absolutely need me. I need to be here to make sure that my daughter's doing well in school, that she's reading, that she's writing, that she's doing all of these things, that my middle child is getting his needs taken care of, that my older son is getting his 504 plan taken care of, because they're not taking care of that when they're virtually learning. I had to have all 3 of them at one point in the same room, basically saying, okay, you need to be quiet. Do you have your headphones in? I need to jump on a call. Don't talk to me. If you need a snack, make sure you're off the screen. And this is the game that working women are trying to play, is let me mute myself real quick while someone comes and talk to me. And you cover your mouth and you're saying, what do you need, while you're trying to pay attention. It's literally the worst thing ever. And I can say that from experience. And my heart really does go out to any other working parent going through it. So if you are a working parent going through it, you all are my rock stars, and you deserve a lot more than what society is giving you. And I swear, if you feel like you need a drink at the end of the day, you deserve it, because we all do. But the graciousness of some employers to say, like, listen, we get it. Like, my daughter will come behind me. She's not even with me at the time. If she was, she would be behind my shoulder waving hello to everyone. They have no boundaries.
Oh yeah, well definitely. Well, I will say definitely shout out to all the moms out there. Shout out to my wife, because I can tell you, she definitely holds it down. I have 3 children, and I know when they were home, we would switch days, and at the end of my day, I would just curl up, in the fetal position on the couch and just go to sleep. It was definitely a rough moment. So shout out to all the moms. But I want to go back to because as I'm sitting here thinking when we were talking about metrics, I want to go back to something that Melissa said earlier. So when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So it's just not about race, right? As you said, it's about veterans, it's about individuals maybe with disabilities. So why, when we look at it holistically, and it could just be my echo chamber, I could be wrong, but when we talk about putting people in leadership, once again for me, I see just a lot of Black folks. Let's take the first Black person we see and put them in the DE&I role. So how does a company really decide who they need in their role? Where do they put them in leadership? What are those? You understand? You understand what I'm saying? What do those metrics look like? Do we need more veterans? Do we need more this or that? So how are companies deciding these things, or are they just going with the current trend of what's happening right now in society?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would say that it's a really sticky thing to be saying we need to have 5 veterans and we need to have 5 this, right? And so, I like to, when I talk with companies about this kind of thing, it's to start at the end. What are you trying to accomplish, right? With this particular position, with your strategic plan, right? And what are kind of the skill sets, the experiences, lived and professional experiences? What are the types of things that you need in order to be successful in helping you get there? And so the goal is not, and is actually illegal from an HR standpoint, to say, we're going to find, the Black person who has these particular experiences. But the goal is to say that we're finding the best person for this role, and that the barriers that have existed to stopping the best, the people of color who could be the best actually show up. So it's not necessarily a intentional kind of thing of like, I have this, once I get to this many people or this particular, in senior leadership, we need this type of makeup, that it happens naturally because you're involving and including and giving the opportunity for the best people for that role. And that is typically people who are different, right? And so if you can get to that place, it becomes less about, we have, this many, we have 1 veteran on the senior team and we have 1 Black person, we have this, and more about like, we have a really, really great team that is bringing all the things we need into these roles. And it happens to be all the people who are diverse and different. And that's where I think I would like to see companies get to.
Yeah, I would completely agree with Whitney in, starting from the end, right? I hope that the conversation behind closed doors is not, we need to put somebody in the DE&I space. We need a person of color who's the best for it. I would hope that what's happening is, what are we trying to accomplish, right? What are the skill sets and traits that we need to have of that person, not thinking about, their color or anything, but what are the values that person needs to have? And then asking, the organization ask themselves, are we ready for that, right? Because oftentimes what you even see is you might bring the right person into that role, but if you don't give that person the autonomy to make the changes that need to happen, it doesn't matter if they're in the seat, right? So it's, what are we trying to accomplish? What are the values that we need? Are we really ready to embrace, those type of values? Are we really ready to embrace the changes that are going to potentially come from having someone very different in that seat? And now, let's put it out there in order to bring that person in.
Great. Yeah. And I can't agree more with both Melissa and Whitney. And I think one thing that tends to be missing significantly from a lot of companies is the ability to give all of their employees the voice. So there's one thing that tends to be missing from this DEI conversation from a lot of that executive level position is giving their employees voice. When we see companies, we talk about, we see the power coming from that hierarchical structure. We see that level of privilege, that almost unearned power. But what we don't see a lot is that voice. And what do we do with that? Do we listen to these people? And do we really listen? Are we hearing what they're saying? Are we hearing what our workforce is telling us? If we're just hiring people to say, hey, we hired 7 women, so now we have women and we don't have to do that anymore, is that really giving their female staff a voice in the company? Maybe, maybe not. So it's not just enough about having the right people or the right look, even whether it's ability or not. The fact is, a lot of disabilities are invisible. I'm fairly certain no one on this call would ever guess I have a disability. No one could ever see it unless I speak about it. Fact is, I could have a crisis and die in like 20 minutes. It probably won't happen, but it could. These are things that when you're filling out an application, does the person stop and say, well, maybe I should just say I'm not going to answer this, because they don't want to not answer just one, so they don't answer all of it, if that makes sense. So where does that line fall? And then how much of a voice do those people who are a little hesitant to say, well, I don't really want to answer this, because what if that makes me look like a liability to the company? What would that do? That doesn't really give them a voice in either their job, the hiring process, or even the strategic planning for the company. What does that mean for them going forward? How do we really make an impact if we're just hiring people to fill the spaces? That doesn't mean anything if they don't have a valid voice, if they don't feel comfortable, like they don't feel valued in the company, then them being there doesn't matter at the end of the day, which is really unfortunate. I think we need to get to the root of that, is making sure that these people who are just filling the seats are heard and valued, and they matter to the overall strategic goals to that organization, and the longevity and the innovation and all of these other components that we talk about. They have to be valued, and they have to really be integral pieces to that organization and the ongoing success. So when we look at those kind of role model companies, it's not just about having the right people and the right look in the right places. It's, do the people you have, do their voices matter? Are you listening to them? Are you hearing them? What are they telling you? And do you really implement what they're telling you? If you're not doing what they're saying, what are you doing?
Okay. And I think, Mike, were you going to say something?
No, I mean, I was just kind of thinking ahead. I mean, I saw one of the comments came up about other suggestions for companies that do a good job with this.
Right.
And yeah, if I'm happy to jump into my perspective on that. If
definitely, you can roll right into it. Yep.
Okay, cool. So I don't. It's an interesting question. I know it's a very simple question about the role models with inclusion and diversity, and why I struggle a little bit with it is because we go back to sort of my own circular thought processes. We can look at the numbers, and the numbers are reported. And I think there's actually Fortune magazine puts out, I think you can probably find it on the web. They put out every year the top 100 companies for diversity. And so you can look that up. And I know one of the companies that shows up on that list sort of perennially is a company called Stryker, which is another medical company, which companies I follow. So Stryker Medical is always there, but we have to be careful when we look at that, because they're just based on numbers, and and they have different categories: numbers of minorities, numbers of women, percentages of disabilities. They go on, and so you can kind of massage or play around with that a little bit. What I don't have a good handle on, quite frankly, maybe the others do, panelists do, is at the core of the organization, who's really embracing these values. And I know in my world, I can name companies, but they're not household names. They're companies that I know are mid-sized companies that do just an awesome job of taking to heart inclusion and sharing a power and decision-making process, throughout all the stakeholders. But they're not household names that anybody here would recognize. So I would ask maybe the other panelists if who they could refer to.
I want to answer it a little different. One, I agree with Mike in that you have to be very careful when you see companies that wins awards for diversity, because a lot of times, you're submitting your own application, you're massaging your own numbers. Not to say that, it's not accurate, but you have to be careful. Interestingly enough, right, so every organization I've worked for, maybe like 5 or 6 large corporations in my career, something that I've always talked about openly in any diversity class I teach, unconscious bias or whatever, is that it is not a coincidence, right, that whether I walked in, whatever organization, people of color were in the cafeteria and the call center. That's not an accident, right? And it's not just one organization. It was like almost every large organization that I worked in, that's just how it, was. And the farther that you excelled in your career as a person of color, the less of yourself that you would see. So the way that I would answer that would be, can we, find organizations where, to Mike's point, right, when you tap into it, if you go to the call center, if you go to sales, if you go to the cafeteria, if you go to facilities, if you are in HR, is and not even diversity and like looking around and seeing people that look differently, but are you not seeing those stark differences anymore? And I think when we get there, right, that's the ideal. But there are a lot of organizations where, and I think it's not an organization, I think it's society, right? There's a lot of underlying things in society that lead to that. But that why are there these stark differences in frontline positions versus when you get to senior leadership, that the diversity seems to just disappear, right? So, I don't know that I've ever seen that yet, but I don't think it's necessarily the fault of any organization. I think even systemically, when you look in, neighborhoods, right, you see that as well. When you look at schools, you see the same thing, and our companies reflect that, that same thing. So I think when you can say you're in an organization and, no matter where you go, you're not seeing this stark difference or drop off in the diversity, especially as you when you move up the corporate ladder.
Whitney, I'd love to hear your thoughts before I even pretend to have anything to respond to what Melissa and Mike so eloquently have stated.
No, I appreciate you giving me the space. I think I don't have a ton of to add. I mean, I think unfortunately, I can't call out an organization that I think that is doing it comprehensively, right? And I think that there are a lot of organizations trying. I think that, and this is a journey, right? And so, so I think that it's just more of, where companies are trying and I give them credit for that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would tend to agree. I think there's a lot of this unspoken level of just segregating ourselves. And to Melissa's point, and I've seen it too, is you find a common ground to identify with your peers on, whether it's skin color, which tends to be the most predominant. However, it's unfortunate. I know in some places it's based on the cohort on when you were hired. On some places, it tends to be based on gender. I've definitely worked at companies where the women sat together, but the men never came to the cafeteria. And it's really interesting to see kind of that culture play out in the different organizations, especially when you are able to take the step back and be aware of what's going on. I think when you see it happening and you try to make that cohesive difference, you're going to stop and say, okay, well, I see this happening. Maybe I can step in, maybe I can join their group and I won't be excluded. And that's a very hard thing to do. I think even when we look at human history, one thing that's really difficult for a lot of people is being excluded from a group. And that tends to be why people just inherently navigate towards somebody that looks like them or acts like them. Or if you come on board in a company at the same time and you go through several weeks of training with that same group of people, you're more likely to stay close or closer with that same group of people. Because guess what? You already knew them. You have these certain built-in relationships and these group norms that happened before you entered the general population of whatever organization you're working with. If you don't have that, it might be with whatever team you work with, the people you work with daily. Or it might be with, to Melissa's point, the people who look like you the most. And unfortunately, if the people who look like you the most also happen to be in the same department or level, guess who you're going to talk to more? And it almost puts you at a disadvantage because Black women are less likely to socialize with their managers than white women, who are significantly less likely to socialize with their managers than white men. White men are more likely to report that they have mentors who help them along that career trajectory. White women, maybe a third of them. Black women, maybe half of that third. So we have to think about this in a numbers game. If white men are predominantly more likely to have mentors who help them through the ranks, white women, maybe 33% of those, who do you think is getting hired and getting up those career steps? Because it's not going to be the Black women who are at the bottom rung of that ladder. So we really need to think about this in kind of that, both that micro and macro level. If we're looking at all of it, who's building the different relationships and really who's at fault for that? It's not the fault of the people at the bottom who are just trying to earn a paycheck and keep food on their table. It's a societal problem. It's a cultural problem. There's so many more pieces to it that we need to take into consideration when we're talking about actively fixing this and making the necessary changes to really impact everybody, especially the people who are at that bottom rung.
Yeah, I agree as well. There's so many different factors to include. This is why this is not a Band-Aid situation. You know, anybody who takes this as a Band-Aid situation is doing themselves a disservice, you know, and that Band-Aid can come off easily. So I think this is, you know, indicative of a larger conversation that a lot of companies need to have. And I do think there are some companies who are just doing lip service, massaging the numbers, doing lip service. And as Duncan and I would say, they're Rothsteining, right? It's just showing for show. They're not really doing it for substance. So very good answers from everyone, actually. But we're almost at our time, right, in terms of ending the show. Hate to do it because we have so many other questions. There's so much more knowledge that needs to be dropped on this conversation.
Yeah, I think I have about 25 more questions. I'm just, you know, if anybody wants to do some overtime, I'm here. Okay,
after hours show, right? After hours. But we're gonna end with this one last question. Then we're gonna go into our standard last two questions to end the show. So this one last question is more from an HR perspective, right? Because we are an HR show. So I want to ask a question and get your input on this, panelist. So how does embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion happen in talent acquisition? So how do you make that happen? How do you know that you're hiring the right candidates from outside the organization and you're actually promoting and having succession planning for the ones inside the organization? How do HR departments make that work?
So I'm happy to start off here, just given my background, and in addition to, you know, my direct HR experience, kind of, you know, in leading and being a part of talent acquisition. I also am an executive search recruiter, and so, you know, this is near and dear to my heart as well. And, you know, so I think there's a couple things here. There's so much built into the process of recruiting and talent acquisition. And I think that when you start with it of like, oh, we're just gonna, you know, hire someone, right? You're already at a disadvantage. And we have to think about how kind of the parts leading up to what it means to hire someone are very, very important. And every step needs to be taken with care and really considered about how does this affect our ability to hire a great candidate at the end. So when I think about what it means to, how do you embed, you know, DEI in order to into talent acquisition, to me, it looks like, you know, when I am working with an organization or working with a department and they want to fill a position, right, is we really want to think about that role, right? Like what are you trying to accomplish? And what do you need in order to get that done? And in trying to weed out those biases that exist and come in where, you know, you're looking for someone to, you know, be a cashier and you're requiring a bachelor's degree. And we're saying, well, wait a minute, like, you know, that is going to create inequities and is going to result in a lack of diversity, right? Because you are excluding people, right, who otherwise could have done that job. And historically, like people of color, in some cases, right, haven't had the same experience or had the same access to education like others. And so we want to start there of like, well, what are we actually looking for and making sure there's no inherent biases in that. The next step you're going to think about is, where do I find people, right? And you have to go where people are. And I also think a part of that is also like being able to think outside the box of what a traditional kind of profile, if you will, is for that role. And so, you can't, I have clients and have worked with people who go to Ivy League schools for their recruiting. And you're like, well, right, if you look at the numbers of those schools, traditionally, they have not had high levels of diversity. So it's no surprise that when you make that your focus and make that a target for where you're going to find talent, that you're never going to get diverse. So we have to be thinking about like what other skills and experiences are being brought, and then where do I find that? And be really creative and be open to different people who can come with different perspectives of how to do that job effectively. And you might, find yourself being in a really, really, great place in terms of that hire. The other thing is I would say is you want to look at the process and where there are continues to be opportunities for bias. There is lots of research and it's been proven that there are certain things like showcasing the name of someone that has kind of ethnic sounding names lead to bias and discrimination and being weeded out really early in the process without even considering their application, or being considered and automatically like there's biases built in when I read this and I think this is a Black person, right, based on the name, I am making inherent biased decisions about this person's viability as a candidate. So thinking about ways that you can strip, identifying information so it gives you an opportunity to look at the substance of the experiences and the work that someone brings, and less about, bringing in those biases that exist. Other things about like, how are you assessing candidates through your interview process, right? Do you have a diverse panel of people that you are collaborating with to make that assessment? Or is it one person who, will bring in a ton of different biases that are unchecked because you don't have anyone else that has had that experience with the candidate? So thinking about things like that. And then I also think there's something to be said about recruiting in terms of the candidate experience, because just as much as organizations are recruiting and want people, are bringing people into their space, these people are also interviewing you to see if this is the place that I want to be. And so oftentimes I've seen where candidates have had a really poor experience during that recruitment process and ultimately decline to join the organization at the end. And so we want to think about how are we making these people feel like we really care, that, our words and things that we put on our website around our values around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, right? It doesn't feel that way, right, in the moment. And so I think it's just multiple parts of this process that you have to be really, really careful, really intentional. And it needs to have lots of different voices involved as you go through it.
Thank you. I do. I apologize. I do need to jump off. So I would like to jump in really quickly before I leave. I think one of the key things when we talk about positions and job descriptions is the terms that we're using to describe the responsibilities of some of these roles. And I think that tends to be missed a lot, specifically in certain types of roles, kind of to Mike's point earlier with a lot of sales roles. They'll use a certain type of language to get a certain type of candidate, which is okay to a degree. However, if those terms end up becoming a little bit more engendered or specific to one particular person based on race or gender or any other type of background, then you're excluding certain types of people. Certain language just tends to lend more naturally to more masculine types of professions versus more feminine types of professions. So we want to be mindful if you're in a profession that's more stereotypically masculine, you don't want to alienate potential females from applying because they're going to say, well, I'm not quite what they're looking for, and vice versa. Even when we look at something like teachers, statistically speaking, most teachers are still females. But why is that? It could be a lot because the type of language that gets used tends, especially in the younger grades, like K through 5, tends to be more, you want somebody who's nurturing, who's really understanding, who's empathetic. Well, even when we talk about these gender understandings, we tend to think men aren't capable of doing any of that, which A, is inaccurate, and B, just really discredits a lot of great men who would be phenomenal role models in those types of jobs. The same is true for potential roles that are traditionally and stereotypically masculine. We need to be really mindful of the type of language that we're using when we're talking about these different types of roles, especially if it's not required. If you're at a desk job, there should be no reason for you to include must be able to lift and carry 50 pounds. Okay, well, if I'm sitting here at a call center, do I really need to be able to carry 50 pounds on a regular basis? Never. Like, that is probably not something realistically going to happen. So we need to be really mindful of the expectations and the realities of these different types of roles. If we're saying, well, we need this specific type of skill set, to be really honest about ourselves and saying, do we really need this, or are we excluding people who could be really perfect for this role based on stereotypes and some of those implicit biases that we might not even be aware of? And really have somebody, kind of to Whitney's point, you don't want just one person looking at it. You need somebody else to check that and say, hey, is this really what they need? And somebody else can come in and say, they don't really need all of this. Like, I've sat in a position and I've talked to a manager who said, well, we're looking for a master's. And I stopped her and said, 10 years ago, you didn't even have a bachelor's for this. Why are you requiring all of this stuff when it really isn't necessary? And they don't have a good answer, but it excludes a lot of really potentially talented people. And those are problems in the talent management cycle, that they're explicitly excluding people that they don't necessarily need to exclude because of whatever they want to make up. It's a pleasure being with you guys. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Same
See you,
here.
Dr.
Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye,
Thank you so
Justin.
much. All right, see you. All right. Should I restate the question?
No, I just add, yeah. I just add, I'm not in HR. I'm not in the HR field per se. I've been more of the operation side of it. I love what Whitney said. So I would just repeat that. But the only piece I would add to that is, as new people come into an organization, I do like what Kim said before about mentoring. When we had success, we would actually assign someone from management, senior management, to mentor new people coming in. And it was really, you talk about the lunchroom and all that, and just getting people for some type of rotation so that the individual coming in can feel welcome within the organization, have exposure to what the company does, but also who the people are, and so they can get to know each other without all the pressures of trying to get stuff done at work. And it's really nice to have like a mentor to help you navigate that. And it's not, your mentor is not your boss who's you're hiring. So that's the only thing I would, everything else that Whitney said, I would say, I second wholeheartedly what she said, but just, I like the idea of having a mentor to help somebody navigate the new position.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree. Coming from HR, I would agree with everything that Whitney shared. I agree, Mike, about the mentoring, and I agree with Kim also about the terminology and the verbiage. And then to share it, to give something from a different perspective, I think a core of it is your talent acquisition team diverse, right? So if you don't have diversity within the team that's recruiting, right, there's a lot of unconscious bias that could be there that, we spoke about that people don't even realize. And that's the first layer. And then look at who are the hiring managers, right? So your talent acquisition team is who's going out and recruiting. But to Whitney's point, right, if they're not diverse and they're going to Ivy Leagues, are they looking at HBCUs? Just having an understanding of what are all the different even types of education outside of even colleges, right, that exist that could be good to bring in. But then even taking it to the next level, are your hiring managers, is your leadership diverse, right? Because even if you do a great job stripping information and, you do a really great job of attracting diverse talent, what are the unconscious bias that exist within the hiring team that could potentially, kind of derail that as well? So I think that will be a holistic strategy of making sure you have the things in place to try your best to identify where the biases exist and minimize them as much as possible, but also making sure, do we have the diversity that we need within the organization so that when we do get this diverse talent, it's not being stripped away because people don't appreciate the diverse talent that we're bringing in.
Mm.
Right. Now, I would say just one last thing too. This being in from an HR perspective and being in HR positions in the past, I think it's also important for a company to build its own pipeline for diversity. You know, so you can look in and say, yeah, we want to promote someone from within, because we always think about getting someone, recruiting someone, selecting someone. But what about promoting someone from within that's ready for that opportunity? But if you don't have people that are what you're looking to have in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you can't promote anybody. So you got to make sure that your pipeline is ripe enough so that you have people to promote and that you're building that culture, because it's not going to be overnight that this is going to happen. And just because you hire someone doesn't mean you always hire right all the time. Sometimes we mess up on hiring and we got to go back to the drawing board, but you got to build that pipeline. If companies not building that pipeline, there's no way they can even promote someone from within that's ready for the next step. So also just want to say that as well. So. But we are at, thank you so much. We are at the finish line. These are the last 2 questions, but these are the easiest questions of the day. Trust me, all right? A lot of heavy ones we hit today. Before we go into that, I want to say thank you to our panelists, obviously, for taking their time to come here today. They could have been anywhere else in this big wide world, but they were here today. We also want to say thank you to the audience, with the comments, who are looking. Some people don't look, they just listen. I like to listen to a lot of YouTube. So they were listening, looking, we appreciate you all as well for your time. So these are the last 2 questions. If someone just popped on right now, didn't know what we were talking about, but they were here now, what's the biggest takeaway for our listeners today? So what would you tell them? One thing they didn't look at the show today. What would you say to them?
I would say be open to getting to know people, your neighbor, your colleague, your boss, just the cashier at the supermarket, because that diversity exists, right? It's here. We just don't always appreciate it or take the time to recognize how valuable it can be. So just get to know people and be open-minded.
I would just jump. Okay.
No, Mike, go ahead. That's fine.
I was just going to say, it seems like the topic that we've talked about today is primary in the workforce, but it's just a microcosm of what's happening in the world, the greater world around us. And I think, Melissa, your point's well taken. I think that if we can be more aware and present and understand the humanity in each of us in our everyday lives, it just at some point it has to spill over into the corporate world and how we hold ourselves accountable for doing our jobs at work. There should be, I don't like this persona at work and a persona at home. I mean, we should be consistent in how we treat each other and respect each other and honor each other, and that goes, in the work field, but outside the workforce too. Right.
Good point.
I mean, I think that, what's on my mind is similar to both Melissa and Mike's, which is I do think that whether we are HR professionals who are tasked with or involved in participating in what it looks like, what our DEI efforts look like moving forward, whether we are individuals who are experiencing, hardships or, just issues in the workplace, and whether we are people who are not in the workplace, right? Like in emotional intelligence and being able to build that, right, is going to be a critical piece for us, within the workplace and out to just move our society forward in a meaningful way. And it can be built, and it is about being self-aware, creating that awareness. It is about accepting and being open to other perspectives and different people. And it's about how do we operate with one another in a way that is productive towards all of our goals. And so I think that that's where we want to start, is how do we get people to start thinking and being more emotional intelligence, and that we should make a focus more on, well, people will call it the soft skills. I like to call it essential skills, but around not your technical pieces of I have this expertise and that, this knowledge and this certification, but more about how you show up in the world and how you show up at work is what we need to be working on.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then Whitney, I'm gonna come right back to you for this last question. Okay, you're gonna start us off first.
Okay.
So where can we find you on social media? Where can we find you based on your website?
Of course, yes. So you can find me individual because I think it's important that I am a person and I am not my roles and my jobs, but you can find more about me and who I am on LinkedIn. And it's just like the regular LinkedIn thing, and Whitney Harrington, and Harrington with an E. But for my company, Kith Republic, you can find us at kithrepublic.com, and we are on all social media channels as at Kith Republic, or facebook.com/Kith Republic. So we look forward to you all, connecting with us and with me, and I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you. Mike, where can we find you on social media or your website?
So the website has all my social media connections. There's two websites. My personal one, similar Whitney, I guess, is mdhadvisors.com. So it's mdhadvisors.com. And for the nonprofit that I manage, it's called the transformationyogaproject.org. And so all the other connections. So I also have a big presence on LinkedIn and Facebook. All that's, if you go to the website, you'll see the links there.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate that. Last but not least, Melissa, where can we find you on social media or your website?
Mine's pretty simple and quick, just on LinkedIn. Melissa Purnell, no websites or anything like that, but happy to connect with everyone here.
All right. Thank you so much. Duncan, take us away.
So yes, we definitely like to thank our panelists once again. This I think we have to do a part 2 of this, because I still have many more questions.
I got a lot of questions on this screen.
Right, I got and a lot of questions for all of you, right? Because I think there's some perspectives I wanted to hit that we actually didn't get to did not get to answer. And I know some of our viewers had some questions that we didn't get to touch as well. But you all were so eloquent tonight, so we just want to say thank you once again. Hopefully, we can have you back for diversity, equity, and inclusion round 2. Or part 2. And so, to our viewers, tune in. Not next Thursday, but the Thursday after, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to the Rise and Grind show. And I guess I just want to leave you guys, with the words of Mark Twain: the secret of getting ahead is getting started. You have a good night. Peace. We're out.
Bye. Thank you.
I'm here to tell you about Mercer County Works. This premier job site solves a problem I think most of us have. The job market is competitive. There are many jobs everywhere, but real job opportunities seem few and far. This is Mercer County Works. It's a job site exclusively designed for you. You can apply for jobs like any other job site. Yet the difference between Mercer County Works and other job sites is Mercer County Works contains jobs for Mercer County and its surrounding areas. Job seekers like you can also benefit from resume and career assistance to rise above the competition and land the interviews that you deserve. Whether you are looking for 6-figure jobs, remote positions, internships, or freelancing roles, you can apply confidently for career opportunities in the area. How does it work? It's simple. Visit www.mercercountyworks.com. Search for jobs in the area. Apply for career opportunities that interest you. Not really satisfied with your resume? Then click on the Upgrade Your Resume button on the homepage to get career advice and have a professional resume writer review your resume for free before applying for jobs. On this job site, all career opportunities. Supporting job seekers, recruiters, and employers with their diverse job needs. Exclusively designed for you. Real jobs, real resumes, real results.